Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspective Philosophy, where we try to better our perceptions of the world through philosophical discussion. Today, I'm joined with Steve Godfrey, and we will be discussing antinatalism and consent. So sit back, relax, and let's get into it. Hello, everyone. So, I'm joined here with Steve Godfrey. Speak, Steve, because I don't know if they're going to be able to hear you.
Righto, this is me. I'm here. Can you hear what I'm doing? Can you hear what I'm saying?
Right, so if anyone in the chat could please let us know if you can hear Steve, because I don't.
You don't hear me.
I don't know if I can hear you. Like, I can hear you, but I don't know if they can hear
All
you.
right.
But yeah. So, just to outline this stream will essentially be on whether consent is needed to have children. As in, like, is it immoral to have children because they cannot give consent? That to bring someone into the world would essentially cause them a disservice because they are not being asked and cannot be asked whether they want to receive the harms of being alive. Is that right?
Yeah, that's fair enough. That's a good beginning.
Right, sweet. So, I guess the only thing I really need to find out is whether I can hear you, so just give us 2 seconds to have children.
Sure.
As in, like, is it immoral to have children because they cannot give?
Should I be talking to test that?
To bring someone into the world would essentially cause them a
Hello.
disservice because they are not being asked and cannot be asked whether they want to receive.
I'm talking.
Being alive.
Test.
Right?
This reminds me of the old rock and roll days when we had to do our sound checks.
So, I guess.
Is there anyone in the chat? I can't.
I can hear you, so just give us 2 seconds.
Sure.
Is it immoral to have children because they cannot?
Should I? Hello. I'm talking.
Yeah, I can hear you. Right, great.
All right.
Right, sweet. Right, so, if you would like to outline your argument, mate, and then we'll get into it.
No worries. Okay, so basically, I'm an antinatalist. I've got a position here that I've worked on for I don't know, over a few years of just, and you have to forgive me if I stumble over this. This is my first time on video, etc. Yada yada, but I'll find my flow as we go. So I'll just go into it. The conclusion is that it's unethical to bring people into existence because it non-consensually exposes them to the inevitability of harm, absent purpose, subspecie aeternitatis, which we'll get into later. It's got 4 premises to the argument. Premise 1, harm is an inevitable consequence of being brought into existence. And premise 4, it's impossible to get consent prior to being brought into existence. As far as I can tell, both of those can be taken as read. It's fairly difficult, if not impossible, to knock those out. The second one is P2, humans exist absent purpose, subspecie aeternitatis. What that basically means is we exist absent a purpose beyond ourselves. Like, the whole point of this premise, it deals with beliefs that humans were purposefully created for a purpose, gods, aliens, simulations, etc. And then the final premise 3, this is the one where I think most of the debate probably will happen. It's unethical to non-consensually expose people to inevitable harm, absent a purpose beyond the harm, which in this case is purpose, subspecie aeternitatis. So I hopefully that's a decent enough summary for people to get an elevator pitch grip of what's going on.
Yeah, and if I may, I'll try and reiterate it back to you to make sure that obviously I understand it correctly before we try and get into the whole whether it's right or not. Because I think the point of these debates is to be, sincere to one another. I think we both care about the issue and whether it is ethical or not to have children. Even if, I don't know if I will have children or not, or if I even want to. So it's just one of those things that I think it involves us all, and I think we all want to have ethical and logical rigor when it comes
Yep.
towards this. So,
Cool.
with your argument, it seems that it fundamentally is based on the notion of, well, two notions, like harm and consent.
Sure.
Actively, we want to avoid harm, and that has been taken as a given. Harm is bad, and I think that's fair enough.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
For the most part, I think there is some aspects in which harm isn't necessarily that bad, but then you've qualified that with unless it is for a greater purpose.
Yeah, that's a reasonable way. Purpose beyond the harm itself is enough. Yeah.
Yeah, purpose beyond the harm itself, and whether that harm is consensual. You could have ethical harm if it is consented upon.
Yep.
Yeah. So, okay, so the idea is that when you birth a child, there is no purpose to birth the child that goes beyond the harm itself, and that when you also...
Or I'd correct that. There's no purpose to birth a child beyond the harm. Oh, okay. I see what you're saying there. Yeah. There's no purpose beyond the harm that the person will be exposed to.
Right. So, like, as in the agent themselves will not be exposed to a purpose greater than the harm that is outside of the harm that is caused to them. So,
okay, we'll run with that. Yeah, that's close. That's close enough for Jazz. Yeah.
And then, obviously, they can't consent because they're not alive.
Right. Yep. Yep.
And so that makes it immoral because it's unconsensual and because it essentially brings around harm.
Yes. So, but basically, the whole thing is based on if you have a case where someone is going to be exposed to harm, or let me rephrase that. You will expose someone to harm. It's either consent. You either need that person's consent. It's got to be explicit, substituted, or implied, or you need to have a purpose, as I said, beyond the harm itself. So, for example, a typical example given would be someone in a car crash. They're unconscious. We have to harm them by doing surgery to bring them back to life, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's exactly actually what I was going to bring up. Actually, that's exactly the example. So with the car crash victim, the purpose would be beyond the harm. So what would that purpose be?
Well, okay, so you have let's say you have a car crash victim. So they're obviously already existing before that happens. There is a presumption, which I'm going to assume, if a medical personnel come to the accident, their purpose is to bring that person to life, to either return them to the state they were before the crash, or bring them back to a good enough state where they can continue their life afterwards. And often that will involve harm because you have to cut the person open more, maybe. There's all kinds of surgeries. There could be amputations, any kind of thing. But the whole purpose of that harm, even if the person is unconscious, there's a presumption that you're trying to get them back to where they were before the crash as much as possible.
Yeah, there's a consideration of that person as a moral agent, or as as being morally subordinate, as in like we do care about them.
Absolutely.
And in that respect, that we're respecting their subjectivity, we're respecting their well-being, whatever it may be, and that is the purpose that goes beyond the harm. Okay.
Yep.
And you would deny that would be possible for a child, so I could not consider a child and their well-being because they're not alive.
Okay, so before I answer that, if I could ask, I'd like to challenge the way the question is asked.
Yeah. Okay.
Because you're talking about a child. And
if I may qualify it, then potential individual, potential subject.
Yeah, I think it's important to take the child out of the equation because that gives the impression that you're bringing someone into existence that can actually be protected. But if we talk about bringing a person into existence or an individual, that covers the whole gamut from birth to the death, which is the whole lifespan. So I think it's important that we're not bringing a child, a cute little baby into existence. We're actually bringing a person who will be subject to all of life's harms, just to make that explicit.
No, that's
and now I've said that, I've forgotten your question. I do apologize.
Just whether that there is no purpose beyond harm for bringing into a child, a subject, as I should qualify, into existence. I say child just because you're born a child.
Okay, yeah, sure.
That's why I'm saying.
I get, yeah, that's right. So yeah, I know what you're saying, and I just want to make sure my answer is good enough for that. When we bring someone into existence, they will be exposed to inevitable harm. Harm is inevitable.
I agree.
The whole gamut of harm. So the question becomes, we haven't got their consent, so that's already off the table. So what remains is there a purpose beyond the harm itself that justifies the non-consensual exposure? That's probably the way I'd put it.
Right. And the happiness of the individual or the potential individual is that... all right, one second. Apparently, I'm half as loud as you. So
I'm sorry.
I'll just sort that out. It's not your fault. It's my fault.
Right. I'll back away from the mic, so maybe that'll make a difference.
I should be a little bit louder now. Is this a bit better, guys? I'll move this a bit closer. How's that? Right. So, essentially, so you know, could let's qualify. Could the happiness of the potential agent be a consideration of bringing them into existence that would justify the harm?
That would depend on if you could identify who's coming into existence, I think. And that's one of the arguments I make in the essay, or one of the points I respond to. There is a possible argument where you might say the person I bring into existence, so maybe in your case, maybe in my case, we live in the first world. The person that I might bring into existence might have a reasonably good life overall. Mm-hmm. But we're not talking about the person I bring into existence. We're talking about anybody in the human race, the human species that's actually brought into existence.
I agree.
And so we can't identify who's actually coming into existence in this conversation. So we don't know really, we can't predict what kind of happiness or anything that they're going to experience. It could be fantastic or it could be very minimal. I mean, I heard Magnus speak the other day about one of his, he gave an example of his colleagues, I presume from university or in the lawyer's office where he works. He made the point where someone he knows, probably if they stub their toe, that might be the worst harm they've ever encountered in their life. But then you might have another person who is actually born into sex slavery, for example, and they will be a rape slave for their entire existence. So the point I'm making here is you can't just talk about Magnus's friend. You're talking about the whole gamut of humanity.
Completely agree. I'd say then that includes like a multitude of harms. But then I think obviously there's an important point to differentiate the difference between antinatalism and choosing not to have children. So choosing not to have children in a particular case because of the ethical harm that it would cause a particular agent, because you know that you'd be birthing them into a place of, let's say, starvation. They would starve to death before the age of 1, and all you're doing is birthing someone to suffer and then die. You could see that would be unjustified. I think it would be almost common sense, we'd like to think, but to not have children in that respect. But that's not anti-natalist. You could say that somebody else in another place they not necessarily should have children, but would not be bound by the same moral decision as you, the same moral maxims, because they don't have to consider the same consequences, the same experiences. There's a word I'm looking for and I can't remember it, but essentially the same environment as you will be birthing the child. But that's particular versus abstract. But antinatalism is an abstract universal. Right. And so we'll talk about it as if it's an abstract universal. You're absolutely right.
Sure.
So in which case, we don't know how much the individual will suffer, but we know they will suffer, and that suffering is being taken into consideration. So what I'm asking in now is then, are we taking into consideration the happiness of the individual?
First of all,
individual.
I say that once again, sir?
Or potential individual, rather.
Oh, right. Potential. Okay. Well, potential is the right word, but I wouldn't attach it to the individual necessarily. I'd attach it to the happiness. Ultimately, harm is inevitable, and happiness. And these terms, these terms we're just using those obviously in place of other better terms. But harm is inevitable. Happiness is just potential. It's possible. That's a very important thing to consider, I think. Does that help in answering your question?
I see what you're getting at, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. I'd say that well-being, at least in positive experience, is just as inevitable as harm. I
But
mean,
again, that depends on who you're bringing into existence. You don't know.
no, I don't. I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think it
Okay.
would. I think it would be inherent to that subjectivity that they would feel like, unless they're born into a hellscape of like, just as if they were born into a utopia, they mightn't feel any pain. Like, you know. I think the reality is that the aspect of subjectivity binds pleasure and pain into a unified experience to feel positive and negative psychological or phenomenological experiences, and I think that's pretty much inevitable. I think that even the worst life will feel a minute bit of pleasure, even if it is aspects of relief at times, or even just momentary feelings of joy. They mightn't necessarily feel like great amounts, and they could have overwhelming pain versus that joy, or whatever small amount of pleasure they do actually receive. But I would expect that all lives would also entail the most minute amount of pleasure as well, just to make them a functioning subject, which can differentiate the difference between pain and pleasure. The fact that they have to have a somewhat innate understanding of positive and negative experience to differentiate them properly.
But again, this is something like comes back to the conversation you had with vegan antinatalist. You weigh up. I think you said something like you weigh up the different kinds of pleasures and the different kinds of harms in your ethics. Is that a correct comment?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that kind of. I think that what it's about is the expression of subjectivity, and I think we all all seek to find a life which gives us the greatest expression of our nature, our natural freedom. And natural freedom is to be in a state in which is more positive than negative, and that can come in a variety of forms.
Sure, but again, this comes back to my point of affirmative ethics versus negative ethics. You're talking about, and in my understanding, how to live a good life. What antinatalism is dealing with is whether or not it's good to be made to live. So, for example, you gave the example in your conversation with vegan antinatalist about gambling your money, and you said when you gamble your money, there's risks and rewards, and you never really know what way it's going to come out.
Yeah.
But the problem with your analogy is you're gambling your money, so you carry all the risks and rewards.
Yeah.
When you bring someone into existence, if you're a parent, you're probably going to get more reward than risk from that. But the person you bring into existence for the whole entirety of their life, they are going to be bearing the burden of risk far more than the parent will be. So you're actually still gambling money, but you're gambling somebody else's money without their consent, with the real possibility that they will lose. And that to me is the question that needs to be confronted.
Yeah, I mean, like if we go back to the car crash patient example with the guy that's unconscious, the surgery's a gamble. The individual could wake up more disfigured than if they hadn't had the surgery. And they might have been better off dead. Are they justified in taking the surgery?
But that person's already existing, so there's a presumption. Generally, like in medicine, there's a presumption that you want that person, or that person would prefer to continue living than not.
But you don't know whether that person would choose to live a life which you will place them into. So they're unconscious, and you have the option to create a situation for them which will inevitably cause either greater well-being or greater suffering. Are you justified in taking on making that decision without their consent? Because the issue is the consent, not necessarily.
Well, there's different kinds of consent. There's basically three: explicit, implicit, and substituted. So we can work backwards. Substituted is where you would substitute, like you would have a situation where you'll make a decision for somebody else. A typical example is a parent-child situation. Maybe it could be a medical decision, or a school sports day or something. The parent signs the consent form, and that substitutes for the child. Then you have implied consent, which is the example of the car crash victim, where what somebody does is if we can't get consent from the person, the victim of the car crash, you're probably asking next of kin, if you can find them, for example, or a friend, the closest person. Yeah. Can we find out what this person probably would have wanted? And I'm speaking very, very generally here.
Yeah.
But that implied, so that's implied consent. And then you have explicit consent where somebody gives the consent for something to happen. But for consent to happen, you must have a person who is already identifiable and in existence, and two, the consent must be given prior to being exposed to the harm. So in the surgery situation, you have implied consent, the person already exists, the consent can be implied, and it's done before the harm. When you're bringing someone into existence, there's no identifiable person to attach consent to. Therefore, you can't just assume consent for the harm that they will be exposed to. So I'll stop there and let you go.
Yeah. So in just in reference to that, okay. So if I was to, let's say you said no to, I don't know, a medical procedure, and I was to perform it anyway, that would be wrong. Why would it be wrong?
Okay, so that comes into you call it, I call it personal autonomy. You call it individual sovereignty, I think.
Yeah, regardless. I think the most, same thing, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, of course, yeah. I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing, so whatever. So we use individual sovereignty. So the point is there, you've overridden my individual sovereignty.
Yeah, and that's wrong.
That's correct.
Why?
Okay, this is a great question. So this is where, when it comes to the essay that I wrote, I ground consent. Let me just find it on here so I can actually get my wording right. If you'll just give me 2 seconds.
No bother.
Okay, consent. Right, here we are, non-consensually. So what I've talked about here is I am actually leaning on personal autonomy or individual sovereignty. So if we talk about the harm that is inflicted through surgery, there needs to be consent. If you don't follow the consent rule, as we've just decided, you're overriding their personal autonomy. At this point, I do admit fully, I am relying on whoever I'm talking to or whoever is reading the essay. I'm relying on them thinking that personal autonomy is something that is of high value, I guess, in society, because some people just don't think so. And so when it comes to people who would not be inclined to look at personal autonomy as sacrosanct, then there's probably I can't really go further. So I'm not saying it's a universal value. I'm saying it's something that people either accept or are more inclined to accept or less inclined to accept.
If someone was going to try and kill themselves, would you say you are wrong in trying to stop them?
That's a well-worded question. If someone was trying to kill themselves, would I be wrong in trying to stop them? I think yes, from the information that but I'm assuming information in this myself. Yes, I would say yes, that's a wrong.
You'd say it's wrong. Okay. So what about the people that are glad that people have stopped them? They're happy to be saved.
Okay, so if someone's, for example, about to jump off a bridge and I pull them back, and then afterwards they say thanks very much.
Yeah, I wasn't in the right state of mind.
Right. Yeah, okay. I know where you're heading with this as well. I'm assuming, I think so. I wasn't in the state of mind. Whew. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I mean, I'm thinking of my philosophy and my reality. In my philosophical head, I'm thinking I don't have a right to interfere, but then I'm putting myself in a position where I'm walking along and I see someone doing that. I don't know if I wouldn't.
Right. See, I would say that a lot of the time you'd be justified in interfering, even though I do value personal sovereignty.
Okay, I'm sorry. Sometimes you will be justified.
Sometimes,
but again, sometimes. That's going to depend. The person might just be really angry about the fact that you intervened. That's something you don't know. The person
could be compos mentis and be making a rational decision, and in which case you're in breach of their sovereignty.
Right.
I suppose, like for example, you know, it could be like force feeding someone who's on like a hunger strike as
Mm,
an act of
mm,
rebellion, for example. Would we
mm,
say that was the
mm.
same thing? It's very different, isn't it? Um,
Right. Yeah.
and I think that considers the individual agent and whether they're mentally sound. But the reason that would consider their mental soundness and not simply their act of volition, I think, shows the fact that the individual can act in a way that is counter to their own will, and in
Mm,
such a way they are actually denying their own subjectivity. So someone who's indoctrinated can do the same. They can be acting upon the will of another and not their own will, and therefore be denying their own subjectivity. They could be acting within slave morality. Would you
yep.
agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we can point to 101 hypotheticals, but as far as for me personally, as a principle that I would kick off from, I do believe personal autonomy is a very high value. And if someone wants to take their life, I think they have the right to do so. That would be my starting position.
See, I think that like when it comes to, I think we should respect the subjectivity of individuals. I think that a lot of the
Hmm.
time when people do want to take their own lives, I think for the most part, I would actually argue, they're not mentally sound. I think most people are.
But okay, well, what do you base that on? Because I don't necessarily agree with that.
Because I think that most people who want to take their own lives are in a state of perpetual depression. I mean, like I've been suicidal before myself. I've also
Hmm.
known many people who have been suicidal, and I've dealt with charities and stuff like that that have
Mm.
helped people get through depression. And
Hmm.
depression is, I would characterize as a condition which can be life threatening, but it's
Hmm.
also curable.
Right.
And in that, it seems that many people who do take their own lives, I think, could be characterized as depressed and therefore a risk and a danger to themselves.
Hmm.
Now, whether they are being rational or not is the important thing. And I don't think I've seen many people who've left suicide notes that
Hmm.
describe a rational procedure of wanting to take their own life. As in, now I have heard that from people who want euthanasia, on the other hand.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there's people that want you. My life could not be worth living because I will perpetually get worse. Today is already bad enough. I can't take any more pain. My life is ultimately going to become more negative than positive for X reasons, and I can instantiate this because of this medical information and so on. Don't typically see that from most suicide attempts. I don't think. And so I think I wouldn't say it's absolute. I mean, don't get me wrong. I can't ask everyone who ever tries to kill themselves whether they've got good
Sure.
reasons to or not. But I think there's also the fact that when we do try and kill ourselves, we do it on subjective rationality without talking it through with another individual, and we don't come to these conclusions on an institutional basis. We
Hmm.
don't do it in a way that would actually allow our reasons to be tested, verified, or falsified, and therefore is
Hmm.
actually caprice. So that
Okay.
there's that issue as well.
Hmm.
Excuse me. But the reason I bring this up is because I
Mm.
think that it just shows an example that even if sometimes it's the case, that there's times when it's not the personal autonomy of the individual that we are respecting, in the sense that it's
Hmm.
not their act of volition, but rather their will. What would their act of trying to modify the world in such a way that it would benefit them. The actual act of their own subjectivity within the world, trying to be a positive experience for that subject. And they
Hmm.
value themselves inherently through their evaluation of the world. And I think that's what they are. That's what we are respecting. This
Hmm.
evaluation of the world and this expression of their own freedom, which is
Sure.
to create the greatest experience possible for them,
Hmm.
or the greatest experience possible for everyone, especially for someone who's doing ethics.
Hmm.
So the point I'm making is essentially that if personal autonomy is, it's you're not in you're not doing you're not in breach of their consent if you save a life that, well, if you do harm to someone, sorry, you're not in breach of their consent if you reject their volition in respect to their subjectivity.
Hmm.
I think could be argued. So you could say that I actually did it for you,
Hmm.
because you weren't thinking straight. And then they might turn around,
Hmm.
and then there is times when they turn around and go, yeah, thanks. Or they might go, you bastard, you've ruined me death.
Mm.
But it happens. And in which case, I think asking, when we talk about the consent of an individual, it's not necessarily breaching the volition. That's the important thing. It's breaching their subjectivity. You're in breach of their will. You're actively going against their freedom and their will. Now, obviously, this is very different to someone who has not been born. But I do think that we are considering that same subjectivity of the unborn, in the sense that we are considering the subject themselves. So I think that when we ask whether it is right or wrong to have children, like as in this individual cannot consent to the harms that they will experience, is this wrong? When we say they do not consent, what we will reference consent against is a subjectivity, because consent is in reference to the subjectivity. Would you disagree with that?
I disagree with the phrasing. It doesn't matter whether after the fact they would or they wouldn't consent to having been exposed to harm. I don't think that's particularly relevant. Or I think what the only relevant point is, it is impossible to get their consent to be exposed to inevitable harm. How do you justify? I mean, just because we can't get their consent, that doesn't mean we can do without it.
I know.
Okay.
I know what you're saying in the sense that, but then I would just ask you, what's the value of consent? What would you say the value of consent was?
Well, okay. And so again, I think this comes to negative and affirmative ethics. In the affirmative ethics, the value of consent, as we've already discussed, is personal sovereignty, the right to choose how you move, how you think, that kind of thing. But when it comes to negative ethics, as my understanding, I'm still trying to grapple with this idea myself. We're not dealing with somebody who has presumed interests. We're dealing with nothing. We're dealing with a future person that we are deciding you will have interests. I'm making that decision for you. And I think these are very different conversations. Even the suicide conversation, if I'm seeing somebody jump off, looking like they're about to jump off a bridge, in my mind, it could be analogous to the car crash victim. I'm thinking in the back of my mind, maybe this already existing person has, there is a reason to continue their existence. That's from my perspective, because there's a person in front of me and the way I've been brought up, my culture and all that stuff, that's a value that I'm imbued with. When it comes to bringing a child into existence or a person into existence, there's nobody there. So how do we... By what standard do we assume to be able to put them in a position where they're exposed to the harm? I'm circling back to what I said before. What's the basis that we can just assume that? That's what I would put back at you.
It seems like there's almost like for me, like just with the way you described that. So it started off with you describing that there was nothing, and that what we are considering is nothing with negative consent. The idea is that what we're considering is whether we'll put someone into the position in the first place. But then you describe that as considering nothing. But then it always circles back to the idea of having to be someone who we are considering who would not necessarily have wanted to be.
Okay, so yeah.
Even if they don't want to be, even if they are really glad they're alive, there has to be that person who feels harm.
Okay, so let's try and look at it just a little bit of a different way. Let's assume someone already exists, but you don't know who they are, or you don't know anything about them. You just know that in the next 1 year, this person, whoever it is, wherever they come from, is going to come into your life in some kind of situation. So before that happens, you create a situation which will expose them to some kind of harm. So I don't know, I'm just thinking, just shooting from the hip here, you're going to put them into a rugby match, which involves, tackling and all that kind of stuff. You don't know who they are, whatever. So they come into your life and you just chuck them into the rugby match. Is that ethical?
Well, I think...
Did you understand? Is that enough?
I see what you're saying, but then I don't think that's what we do with children, is it? We don't just throw them into rugby matches. Like I think
the rugby match is just an analogy that they'll be tackled on the field. There will be some kind of harm. It might just be a a punch on the shoulder, and it could be a full-on brawl. I mean, I don't know,
Yeah.
but there will be some kind of harm. But there will also be good things. There could be the feeling of victory, of camaraderie, of of being praised by the crowd, whatever. There's all these good things. I mean, this is a weird analogy, but the point I'm making is you didn't know who that person was before you made these decisions. Before you made the decision to put them in the gladiator's ring, as it were. Even though they're still alive. So my point is, you know that they're alive. Is it ethical to do that, but you don't have any clue who they are?
I think saying knowing who they are is...
No, not knowing who they are. You don't know who they are.
I know, but the action of not knowing who they are is a nescience from which is arguably an act of unnecessary risk taking. Because, like, if let's say I knew who they were, it just so happens that it's Jonah Lomu. And he's going to absolutely smash this rugby match. He's going to have a great time. Changes things.
Very good reference, my friend. I'm pleased you did that. Nice.
Yeah, like that could happen, right? I understand.
Sure.
But then, what we're saying is that there's a risk in doing that. Okay, and that risk is caused by my lack of knowledge and my inability to have knowledge in this.
No, not at all. The risk is not caused by your lack. The risk, our lack of knowledge of the identity of the person who's going to be thrust. Let's take away the rugby thing. It's just we'll put them in the gladiator ring or whatever. It makes it simpler, I think. But you don't know who that person is. You don't know how equipped they're going to be for that situation. Mentally, whether they can cope with it. Physically, whether they can cope with it. But you're making a decision before you know anything about them. I think that's unethical.
Right. And it's unethical because the acting on behalf of someone you know nothing about is impossible because you cannot respect an individual from which you have no knowledge.
Yes, because the basis of consent, whatever the three consent things are, you have to be able to identify the person to have an understanding of what their interests are going to be. Right. And if you can't identify them, that's when you have big problems.
Okay, so I have 2 points to make then.
Sure.
So the first one is you have to identify the person to know what their interests are going to be. So that would mean...
They have to be identifiable, yeah.
So I cannot act in a positive in regards to them without knowing who they are going to be. I would disagree. I would say that an individual has a basic nature from which can be understood. I think that an idea of humanity, for the most part, I mean, even in the basic, most physical form, and then more abstractly in towards more psychological, emotional, and economic, ecological, whatever it may be, like extrapolated onwards needs of that individual, wants, desires in relation to how they can, live a life that would be worth living, a life that would be positive. I think we can come to these conclusions based on humans, not on an individual human. I think an individual human is a particular expression of that nature and has in turn many caveats and differences from which may not be fully accounted for within an abstract theory of humanity and abstract nature, from which we try and understand the individual in respect to their culture, their environment, and the life in which they live. But we'll get onto that in a minute. The second part would be, if we can't respect their subjectivity in the sense that I can't have, if I don't have knowledge of them, I can't know their interests, then how do I know that they are going to suffer? So if I must have some knowledge of it to know that they are going to suffer, and I must have some...
If you put them into a rugby match, they're going to suffer harm.
I agree, because I have knowledge of...
The rugby match.
I have knowledge of them. Just as, I mean,
no,
I have to have some knowledge of them, don't I? Because otherwise, I mean, if they were born and they were made of, if they were born but they were made of steel, or they couldn't feel pain and their nerves are dead, whatever it was, I have some knowledge of them, at least in respect.
This is exactly the point. If some knowledge is not the same as absolutely no knowledge. And the analogy I'm giving, you have absolutely no knowledge of this person.
What I'm saying is that would be impossible. I have to have some knowledge of them and their humanity.
Okay. So you have to have some knowledge of them and their humanity. What are you getting at there?
So, for example, to have knowledge that they will suffer, I have to acknowledge that they are first human. And if I have knowledge of humans, then I have knowledge of them in a minimal aspect, don't I?
Okay, so we're agreeing that humans that humans experience suffering. Is that what we're agreeing on?
So humans experience suffering, that humans may experience well-being in certain forms,
Oh, sure, sure.
and humans may benefit from, let's say, a caring family,
Mm,
psychologically developed, an environment which will help them develop psychologically properly, and so
sure,
on.
sure.
And then we'll maybe identify what those environments look like, and so on. In which case, when I'm throwing them into the rugby match or whatever analogy we're going to use, or I'm bringing them into existence, which is
Yeah.
then I'm doing so in respect to a basic understanding of what they will be, in the most
Yep.
minimal respect. But this is
Okay.
a very minimal understanding of nature, because I think we
Mm,
gain most of our nature after we're born. I think that's where we
hmm.
gain most of our psychological development through conceptualization, where we learn and develop within the world, and I think that's where most of ourselves, as we'll call it, are
Hmm.
developed. The expression of like the self from which determinates our actions
Hmm.
is fully formed at that point. As in,
Hmm.
we may exist before we are born as raw possibilities, as little blank humans. But once we are born, we are exposed to an environment which will allow us to express those possibilities in such a way to reflect that basic nature from which we're born.
So, if I understand you correctly, so when we come back to the argument that I make in the essay on its premise 3 and premise 2 about a greater purpose, are you saying that the potential for well-being is a purpose beyond the inevitable harm that they'll be exposed to?
Um, Depends
Does
on what you
that
mean
does
by
that
beyond.
okay,
As
okay,
in,
so yeah, so that's a really good point. The harm itself has to um, create or has to cause the greater the good that's beyond the harm. So, for example, it's a surgery kind of thing. If someone gets a bullet in their leg, I put a knife in their leg to cut the bullet out. Me putting the knife in their leg is a harm, but there's a greater purpose to that harm, which is actually in fact a benefit.
mhm.
So it has to be caused by the harm. The benefit has to. I don't want to get into words like derived because that gives me nightmares. But but that's what I'm trying to say. If that makes sense, it's the purpose beyond the harm has to be derived from the harm, and it actually has to be a benefit. That's the argument I'm making.
So would I say that the well-being of the individual was caused by the harm of bringing them into existence?
It's not the harm of being brought into existence. I'm happy to call being brought into existence
Neutral.
itself as, yeah, for basically, yeah, again, close enough for jazz. But it's the harms that the person will inevitably be exposed to. And it just seems to me you're arguing, you're trying to suggest that the potentiality of well-being actually, we don't have consent, but the potentiality of well-being actually justifies the inevitability of the harm they'll be exposed to. That seems to be what you're pushing for here, if I
Yeah,
understand correctly.
that if they were to possibly live a good life, that it would justify the possibility of them living a bad life. Is exactly what I'm pushing for.
Right.
Um, but I guess like essentially what you're saying is then the act of bringing them into existence is neutral. Yeah.
Well, what I mean by that is, the reason I use that term, and I'm just shooting from the hip again here, is because the harm I'm focusing on is the harm that they're exposed to after being, or from being brought into existence. So you can debate. Yeah, I do think bringing someone into existence is itself a harm, but I think that could almost take us on another road. We can go down there if you want to, but I don't. That's not the argument I'm making. Being brought into existence exposes you to inevitable harm.
Okay. So, but in that respect, then it would be
Mm.
it's a wrongful act because it exposes you to harm. Um,
No, yeah, okay, yeah, that's right.
um, so it's like if I drop you into a tank full of sharks,
Yep,
there's a chance that the sharks will leave you alone. But the act is
yep,
wrong because it opens you to the possibility of experiencing harm. But the act itself might not necessarily be harmful. You're not harmed by falling into the tank, especially if you're unaware of the shocks.
I'm going to say yes to the analogy, but again, in that analogy, I mean, I do think that dropping me into the tank is a harm because you're exposing me to the possible harm of the sharks, which is possible. I agree with that. So maybe the analogy dies a little bit, but the harm I'm focusing on specifically, so you dropped into a tank of sharks, it is only potential harm. When you're brought into existence, it's inevitable.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
That's a big difference.
And the prevention of that, the pretension of harm is a positive. You would, and that's why you would say that we shouldn't have children.
Because again, I'm leaning on the principle. So, okay, how can I say? I think, in a sense, pronatalism is basically based on a fallacy of special pleading. So the argument, again, I'm making here that it's unethical to non-consensually expose somebody to inevitable harm. In day-to-day life, that's a principle that, most of us, I assume you, me, people listening to this will probably agree to. We don't non-consensually expose people to inevitable harm in our day-to-day life. Would you accept that?
I don't. Somewhat. I think we do actually inevitably do.
We inevitably do. Absolutely.
But I think we could even say it's a good thing if, as you say, the harm was for a greater cause. So
sure. We live in a society. So I'm not saying that never happens, but I am saying as a not even bedrock principle, most people would kind of use that as their kicking off point.
Right.
That we shouldn't non-consensually expose people to inevitable harm. But when it comes to procreation, bring someone into existence, suddenly the walls go up and everyone goes, oh, no, not in this situation. This is a different situation. And I want to know why. Why is it different? Why is suddenly this principle that we consider just the fallback in normal life, suddenly, for this special situation, it doesn't apply? Why?
I would say I think it's for the same reason that for the inverse. I'd say that because the idea of someone feeling inevitable positive is also an arguable position to have, that the individual will experience something good as well. So that's what they're considering. I don't think parents, for example, are like, I think a lot of people think parents are incredibly selfish and that they're just doing it for their own sick, twisted like self-satisfaction. I don't think they are. I think most people, like, when they have children, are considering whether their children will have a good life in some respects. Some maybe not too much, some more than others. But I think most parents do want their children to live good, happy lives, and they're not doing it on purely selfish interests.
Yeah, I mean, I'd challenge that again. There's a lot of assumptions in that statement.
I think. I mean, it's not something I necessarily have to defend anyway. It's not like the crux of my argument.
Okay.
I just think that individuals aren't necessarily acting inherently selfishly.
I think to say selfishness, I've always thought that's kind of a bit of a, I don't know what's the word, a wrong-headed way of approaching it. But you said self-interest or something. That was the other term you used. Like, I think there's a difference between selfish and self-interest, if that makes sense.
Well, I think everything's somewhat self-interested.
Of course.
But then I don't think that's necessarily wrong. I think that, like, to say that would mean that, like, it would nullify ethics as a whole and place us into like this idea of that unless you are born even if you are born an agent that is you could not be born an agent that did not have self-interest, because your desires will always be your desires, and so will relate to you and your satisfaction of those desires. So unless the original motivation was not desire itself, then, which I would say was metaphysically impossible, then you're going to have then everyone would be not only immoral, but everyone would have to exist in a non-egoistical sense. Like, the individual would have to transcend their own ego to exist in such a way that they hover above themselves and do not need to consider themselves in anything they do. They'd have to be like butter. I think to really like be in that situation, and even then, I think that let's say you are like this Brahmin kind of figure, like then you are probably not acting in the world because you would have no basis from which to act, because you would have no concepts to pull upon, no content of your desires that would motivate the body of your form forward to behave within the world. You would actually be in a conceptual void, and you would subsist and then die. But also, I hope you can hear us, by the way. The chat was asking if to turn my mic up. I've moved it a little bit closer. Hopefully that's a bit better. I think the point I'm getting at is that the idea of dropping someone into the tank or bringing them into existence, the idea is that we're doing it because we're trying to prevent inevitable harm. But
whoa! You're dropping them into the tank to prevent inevitable harm.
The reason that we wouldn't do that is to try and prevent inevitable harm. So like bringing them into existence, we wouldn't. The idea of possibly causing, or the idea of causing them harm, is immoral. So we don't do it. And on the inverse, let's say, bringing them into the world will cause inevitable pleasure. The reason we don't bring them into the world is to prevent them from causing inevitable pleasure. Do you see what I mean? That's the issue. So there is an aspect of positive and negative consideration for the agent, even at that point. Like when we talk about the act of bringing them into existence, it must be in reference to that subjectivity. That's kind of the point I'm getting at. The existence itself, the
subjectivity of the person being brought into existence.
Yes.
Okay.
Because otherwise it doesn't make any sense. You have to talk about whether the basics of their nature, they're experiencing harm. You have to talk about having basic knowledge of them in the fact that they will experience harm, that they will experience some sort of positivity, and in that we are considering the positivity and negativity of their experiences. Now what we're saying is that on an abstract level, can we derive a notion from which will tell us that we can universally apply that it is wrong to have children because of the harm that they will experience, subjects, because of the harm that they will experience, without considering the possibility of the goods they will experience. And I just don't know why. Why is it that I don't consider the positive experience of the agent, but I only consider the negative?
So again, I think I'd give two responses to that. Again, harm is inevitable. Pleasure or good well-being is potential. So those are the two things you're weighing up. Secondly, my mind's just gone blank. I hate it when that happens. I had a brain freeze.
Oh no, sorry. Happens to me all the time.
Yeah.
I'll reply to the first point. Maybe the second point will come back.
Sure. Thank you.
So, the idea with it being possible, I disagree with that. I think that it is. Okay. I think it is inevitable that you feel some sort of good, just to allow you to differentiate metaphysically the experience of pleasure and pain, or positive or negative. How great those positive and negatives will be in your life will differ massively depending upon the life you live. But I think those the differentiation between qualitative experiences is necessary for you able to actually differentiate one from another. You couldn't be in a perpetual state of suffering and understand it as suffering unless you had less suffering, happiness, some other positive experience to contrast it against, which is perhaps why people with a greater contrast in their lives in a certain scenario, for example, from rags to riches, seem to be more appreciative of the positives of certain aspects of their experience, because they're able to differentiate them to a greater degree than someone who was born with a silver spoon in their mouth and perhaps sees, the world in a single shade of positive. They don't actually gain the full expression of those positives, quote unquote, because they can't psychologically differentiate the aspects of their experience metaphysically. So you could see that the experience of varying notions and even concepts, I think concepts give a great historical account for these things. So I don't necessarily need to be eaten by a shark to know that that's going to be absolutely awful. And if I was unsure, I can hear about people being bitten by sharks, their experiences, and go, this sounds like a terrible idea. I don't know, I want to be eaten by a shark. And I can get knowledge of it in that respect as well.
Right.
But essentially, when we talk about the possibility of having pain and pleasure, I do think that for it to, if all experiences were a single unified qualitative range, we wouldn't necessarily talk of pain and pleasure. It would lack. What's the word I'm trying to? Because with like, what I would say is, like, how would you derive what pain was without an experience of relief or pleasure? There would be no way to do that. I think metaphysically, I think we do need that contrast. There's that famous quote. You cannot.
Oh, you right, mate?
Yep. 1 second.
No worries.
It's catching me late.
Resuming normal transmission in a few moments, folks. Thank you for joining us.
Right. Wow. I was lucky. Anyway.
Good on you, mate. Well done.
Okay. We are back.
Part 2.
Yeah. So in terms of whether the individual will experience the possibility of so we're talking about. I've been shot sideways since the
right. So you've got the brain freeze now.
Yeah.
Okay. So you were talking about, like, dropping in the Shark Tank, how the subjectivity of the people we're bringing into existence. Someone's born with a silver spoon in their mouth.
Oh yeah, the contrast of their experience being necessary for the metaphysical differentiation between pain and pleasure, which allows for a qualitative understanding of the experience in such a way that would give enough information to say this is pain, this is pleasure. I think that is somewhat necessary. I think that when I say, like, could I imagine a being that was just born and experienced nothing but pain, to the same degree consistently? I think most probably, based on the fact that the individual would have to have an experience of, like, to understand what pain was in the first place, they would have to have an experience either inherently encoded into them, as in, like, what's the word? What's the inherent knowledge, or they would have innate knowledge, or they would have to, or they would have to have differentiated them after the fact. I think it's most likely a form of innate knowledge that exists, as in, like, you necessarily you don't have to know what pain is to feel it. It's an experience. The experience itself is the information, and it is in a negative form. It's already pre-coded for you in a negative form from which you then interpret. And in which case, then you would be able to interpret that this is experience. The experience is suffering in that respect. And on the opposite could be said for pleasure. But then when we talk about pain and pleasure actually being things, we wouldn't talk about positive and negative in that respect. We would talk about simply, we wouldn't have a word for pain, I don't think, and a word for pleasure, because there would only be an experience of negative. We wouldn't necessarily characterize a polaristic experience of the world. So I suppose metaphysically we could maybe differentiate pleasure without pain, or pain without pleasure, but that both contrasting each other is what gives subjectivity its polaristic understanding. I think that's fair enough. I'm just sort of talking myself through it now.
Sure. Do you mind if I respond to that?
Yeah.
So again, I agree with everything you said. I have absolutely no dispute with it. We're here. We try and navigate our existence as best we can everyone has their different ideas, but, to avoid as much pain as possible and get as much well-being as possible. That's basically, I think, how people live. That's cool. And I think what you're talking about fits in that rubric, but that's not the question being asked. Mike, you seem to be answering the question, once we're here, how do we weigh everything up? The question I'm asking you is it acceptable to force somebody into the position without their consent, without knowing anything about them? Is it acceptable to force them into the position where they have to make these kinds of choices? And a lot of it's not choices, a lot of it's luck. I mean, this afternoon I was thinking about the trolley argument, that old example of where you have 5 people on the track and there's a tram coming down. And so there's always would you pull the switch and you'll just kill one person, you do nothing, it kills 5. But what antinatalism asks is, why do we bother putting people on the track in the first place? And that I think is a really important difference. I mean, it could be. I'm not trying to be rude to you, because I absolutely not. But I think that's the point you might be missing.
Yeah, I know. I do actually understand that. I mean, the reason I was talking about it really was to understand whether there was because what we're talking about is abstract notions of universally applied concepts from which we derive notions of whether it was applicable to bring a person into existence, from which we'd have to take into consideration whether we are bringing into existence into an experience of pure suffering. If we were, could someone be brought into an experience of just suffering or pleasure, blah, blah, blah. And I think it's possible. I don't think it would necessarily characterize a human being. I don't think that would be possible for a human. But then maybe possible metaphysically. And that's what I was kind of working out in my head, whether like that abstract notion could be brought around in that respect. And I think if this person is going to be a Meeseeks, from Rick and Morty, don't push the button, you're a bastard. But in that respect, it's like you're not pushing the button because you're bringing them into existence as an existence of pain. If you were to push the button and you were to bring them into an existence of pleasure, would you be justified in bringing them into existence? I think you would be. I think you would be fine with it. I think there would be nothing wrong with that. I think if anything, there might even be something wrong with that. You've just caused someone you've just allowed someone to express the subjectivity from which you respect in ethics as a whole.
Sure, and I address this in my essay as well. Like, there is the hypothetical: what if you just the whole of your suffering of existence was one paper cut every year, and if that's the only harm you suffer, would it be good to bring someone into existence? And I wrote that my intuition says yes, but 1, we still don't have a purpose beyond the suffering, and 2, any hypothetical existence like that would operate under a completely different set of meta-ethics. And that's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with this reality.
I mean, the one thing I'll have to say is, like, when you say purpose beyond the suffering, saying, like, does the suffering cause something greater? But we're not talking about causing the suffering. So I don't cause the paper cut. I cause your existence, and then the paper cut happens to you. Right?
Okay, so
and
that comes down to that.
And in that, I cause both the positive and the negative.
Oh, sure, I agree. You do cause both.
Does it still not fall under the rule of double effect? Because I would say it would.
No, because I mean, I think we both concede. I think we just did concede that if it was, for want of a better phrasing, pure pleasure, we could almost have a duty to bring someone into existence. But if you want to take it to its limit, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about the fact we're not talking about exposing people to pleasure or to winning $1 million in the lottery. We're talking about exposing them to the risk of bearing the brunt of the loss.
Yes,
bearing the harm.
True. That's true. But then we'll start talking about whether we are likely to be bringing them into a scenario that is better or worse. But that is something that comes after the fact. So,
but can't we just use the veil of ignorance on this? Like, if I was to say, looking back over human history, do you think just if you, and this is getting into non-existent beings, which is very awkward phrasing, but let's just say, for example, there are non-existent beings waiting to come into existence, just purely for example, for the hypothetical.
Yeah.
And all you're going to say to them is, look, I'm going to bring, I'm the person who opens the door for you to come into existence. So here's the deal. You can come into existence at any point in time in history, and any family, any possible situation from the beginning of Homo sapiens until where we're at now. If you choose to come into existence, you're going to come into existence within that time frame. However, I'm not going to tell you what kind of life you're going to be born into. I'm not going to tell you anything. The only thing you know is that you're just going to be born into that time frame at anywhere at any time. Would you take that chance?
Well, I think the strange thing is that this place is a false a false analogy in this respect, right? Because there is one difference, right?
Yes.
Let's say that the individual knew when they were going to be born, right?
Okay, but
to what family?
Yeah.
To what environment? And so on, right? Because the ethical decision is being made by the parent who exists in that scenario with that knowledge. See, I do take Robert Nozick's criticism of the original position seriously, where he just basically says, well, what we're talking like as if, like, you know, goods fall from as manna from heaven. You know, this idea, it doesn't make any sense. The idea is if you abstract the notions of positives from the reality in which they are being experienced, then it does seem to be quite a rationally ambiguous scenario where you do have these like kind of you know, if you could be born from now, like as in the, like, I don't know, from the early Paleolithic period, is it Paleolithic?
Oh mate, you're talking to the wrong guy.
You know, essentially Stone Age, and you know, to now. You're certainly probably going to choose somewhere around this time, maybe a little bit later, like earlier, or maybe very much far into the future if you could see what was going on.
Oh, sure. But if you can't do that,
you can't do that, right? But let's say that's not the position that's being presented to the unborn, like in that respect. The position being presented to the unborn would have to be to reflect the scenario of an agent acting in the world to whether or not to bring a child into the world would be in consideration of their own time and environment. I don't
get that. Can you please repeat that?
So the individual wouldn't be presented in this original position with abstract notions of not knowing who, as in like where they are going to be born, the environment. They don't know who they're going to be. That's fair enough. Like as in they don't know the natural abilities, they don't know the health, they don't know any of this.
But and they don't know where they're going to be, and they don't know when they're going to be.
Well, I think you see, that's the thing. I would contrast where and when, and the environment in which that's the knowledge that they would have. So they would have knowledge of their parents, they would have knowledge of their environment that they're going to be born into, and that they would have knowledge of you know, their basic nature. They know they're going to be a human, you know, and their experience. And I think that in which case the individual would be able to, if given the scenario, decide whether it was positive or negative in that respect. Whether
fair
it
enough.
Would, and that would change the scenario from being, wow, this is definitely not worth it, to it depends. And that's, I guess that's the point I'm trying to make throughout all of it, because the individual may exist in this idea of you know, and in this they don't choose whether they're going to exist, rather, and it may not be consensual. Of course, then I think consent, obviously, I don't think it makes sense for consent to be considered without reference to the agent. I think the potential agent. I think that's the point, because it's always, consent is an expression of either personal sovereignty, as you said, or subjectivity in the will, which is what I said. I think it's the will and the subjectivity itself, not just the simple act of volition.
So you believe if consent is impossible, then we can do without it?
Well, I don't say if consent is impossible that we can do without it. I'd say if consent, it's not as if we can do without it. It's that I cannot, like, I cannot respect it. I must be able to respect a subjectivity in the same way, a potential subject, in the same way as I would a subject that was unable to consent. Otherwise, the notion of consent would be inapplicable to the ethical decision-making process. So if we're talking about the argument from consent for antinatalism, and consent being an ethical consideration, then it must be in reference to the potential subjectivity of the agent and whether they would have wanted to exist in this way, whether it would respect their will. So I can agree that an individual might have a bias even once they have been brought into existence to want to continue, but that the expression of their will, their nature, might fundamentally be the opposite. So a meeseeks in the idea of Meeseeks, I think, in the idea of Rick and Morty, might have a bias, a cognitive bias, to want to continue its life, to fulfill its purpose, when in reality, it would be better off having not been created or having killed itself because of its fundamental nature. Now, if that's the case, like I can actually agree that I can see that can happen, right? We can have these cognitive biases, and to respect that individual, put them out of their misery. I mean, gaining that information is going to be nigh on impossible, but put them out of their misery in that respect. But that's based off the fundamental nature, right? And the respect of that will. So that, as you can see, the consent always kind of ties into this notion of subjectivity in the expression of will. And I think that has to be the case for it to make any sense.
Okay, so if I could just return back to the analogy, and if I granted you your amendments to the analogy that the unborn knew when and where and to whom they're going to be born into, do you think that every human being that ever came into existence would still make the choice to come into existence?
Absolutely not.
Okay, good. Okay, that's okay. Now we're getting there. So there are you do concede that there are some people for whom existence
there are some lives not worth living.
Not worth living, and that would be intolerable. Okay, thank you. Now, what I would like to put to you is that do you agree that if we continue the humans, do you think that people who have intolerable lives is an inevitable part of continuing the human species? Would you accept that?
I mean, inevitable is a bit strong.
Okay.
I think it's most likely, most probably. Inevitable, not necessarily. I mean, but most likely.
Let me. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna keep going with my. I think it's fair to say that there will always be greater than zero individuals who experience serious harm for as long as humans continue the human species.
I think it's most likely. I think unless there's points of I can't say absolutely because I don't think we'll have the let's make it an absolute. It would have to be it would have to be true true by definition. Like it would have to be an empirical impossibility for it to be otherwise, or a logical impossibility for it to be otherwise. And I don't think either of them are the case.
Do you think that in the whole time the human species has existed, there has always been greater than zero individuals experiencing serious harm?
Yes.
Okay.
But then you can't. The point is that although I do think it is probable, we cannot say that just because it is probable and it has always happened that it always will happen.
Sure.
Do you see the logical the difference?
I do completely agree with that. But what I just because I'm not trying to do a gotcha on it, I'll give you the whole thing and then see what you think. If we you with the analogy, you said that even if they know to whom they're going to be born to, where and when, etc., there are some people who would say that they wouldn't choose to come into existence. My point is that if antinatalism is a universal approach, and if we continue the human species, part of that there's going to be a cost, and there's always going to be people who are suffering harm, which or living in existence, which for them subjectively may be intolerable. And I think this comes to and this is what I mentioned, I think, in my notes to you. You might start thinking a maximum kind of response to this, whereas I think that there's a big difference between pronatalism and antinatalism paradigms of looking at the world. Pronatalism, it prioritizes population level gains, and it minimizes the costs that individuals pay for those population level gains. But antinatalism, on the other hand, focuses on individual costs that people suffer without regard for the population level gains. So I wonder here if there's going to be people who are always experiencing harm who would not have come into existence. So therefore, if we continue, had they had the choice, if we continue the human species, that group of people will always be greater than zero. My question is that justifiable? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. Right. So first, with you saying that antinatalism, the negative, prioritizes the individual experience, well, the pronatalist prioritizes the population and the overall experience.
So pronatalism is population level gains. Antinatalism is individual costs and the quest to get those gains.
Okay, so I
Yep.
would say that first, like just in reference to what we were speaking about with terms of the individual who will inevitably be, or most likely be born to suffer,
Okay.
and that life was not worth living,
Mhm.
and that could happen. One, I would say that yes, antinatalism does solve that issue. So if
Mhm.
we were to all adopt an antinatalist scenario, we would prevent that individual from being born. Hence, the harm done was not done because could not be done. Okay, that's fair
Mhm.
enough. And on the opposite, we could say that all of the lives that were worth living were also prevented. Would you agree there? Yeah.
So again, you're balancing up the harms that some people suffer versus the good, the great, enjoyable lives that other people experience. Am I?
Because you were talking on a population scenario about there would be
Oh,
so many
right,
of,
right,
because
right.
we're talking so many of the individuals would be born, because we're talking at an abstract relationship, not on an individualistic level, whether
Sure,
my
sure, sure,
child will be this
sure.
person or not, but rather whether they
Okay, so
are.
I have a pretty concrete answer for that. So currently, I mean, at 2016, the latest estimates for rape, slavery, or not rape, but slaves. So that includes indentured servants, rape, slaves, the whole gambit of slavery
Okay.
is 40.3 million people. So currently, there are 40 million people who are slaves, human trafficking, the whole thing. I don't, in my opinion, I think that is enough. That is a big enough number to say this is not worth continuing because the suffering of those people is just abhorrent. And
We can get
if
onto the
we
numbers in a minute because that's fair enough. But then
yeah.
that's a different thing.
Oh,
So
okay.
you see,
Okay.
that would change the ethical deliberative process into X amount of harm versus X amount of well-being. Is it worth it? Is the positive or
Okay.
negative worth is it worth me bringing individuals into the world for the opportunity to experience positive or negative, right?
Okay, but bear in mind we're not just dealing with is it good to, like, you have an assembly line, is it good to make 50 cars knowing that five out of 50 cars every time are going to be substandard?
Oh, I
We're
agree.
not talking
I agree.
we're
It's an
talk we're
individual
talking about
and
we're
their
talking about sentience with an extraordinary capacity for experiencing suffering.
and well-being, arguably.
Yeah.
I
And
think
yeah, but there's going to be people who experience far more suffering than they do well-being. That's, and as I say,
and yeah,
uh,
that's fair
yeah.
enough. I think
Sorry.
I would
Yeah.
agree.
Okay.
I guess my point would be that what we're looking at in that scenario was whether that individual, if they had have had the opportunity, would have decided or not whether they would have been
Mm,
born, and that's what the
mm,
consent issue is in regards to the fact that their subjectivity in that respect is being respected or not, as in that individual's will and their well-being, and if that's the case, then what we are doing is we are acting deliberatively upon an individual, and we are not applying an abstract universal to our actions. We are not saying you should not have children, simpliciter. We are like in an explicit sense, do not have children. We are saying
mhm,
consider or not whether it is right or wrong to have children based upon the fact that more people suffer than have well-being, or more people have well-being than suffer. Blah blah blah. Like it becomes a numbers game. It becomes a reflection of that individual and the respect that we have towards that individual as an agent, but in respect to positive and negative experiences then. And then now we
mhm,
can move to that individualistic aspect of,
mm,
are we respecting an individual if we are risking them a life that is not worth living? Um, and again, I would say that it depends on whether we are risking a life not worth living if we take this percentage chance that this person may live a life that is not worth living. And the reason that we would have that scenario in the first place is because we would say that, okay, so many people across the population uh, live lives which seem intolerable, that based
mhm,
upon certain aspects of human nature, I can see that you suffer, that you have positive and negative experience, that there are aspects of that experience from which I am taking into consideration. Your interests, your most vital interests being the most prevalent, your needs for food, water, shelter, your needs for
mm,
psychological well-being, and so on.
mm.
What is the likelihood that these needs are going to be met? What is the likelihood of you developing a psychology which will approach the world in a positive or negative way, and so on? And in which case, I would say that it becomes far more, not relative, because I think that we're still relying upon the overall appreciation for subjectivity itself and the will. But then whether we actually bring a child into the world, or a subject rather, we are considering the minutiae of their situation and not that overall maxim, whether it is good or bad. And in which case, you could even say, like, as an antinatalist, and you could say, like, based upon these numbers, I would argue that for the majority of cases, we are acting immorally when we birth children, because there is a greater likelihood that they will suffer. And you can present that argument.
But I wouldn't make that up. That's not the argument.
I know, because you're talking in an abstract universal. You're saying it is wrong to risk someone.
Universally, X% of people are going to suffer intolerable harm if we continue the human species.